You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're continuing our discussion today about the HBO Max series Burden of Proof, which dropped on the 6th of June. We hope that you've had a chance to watch it by now, but if not, please pause this recording, go watch, and join us again a little bit later.
It's a terrific series about the February 1987 disappearance of Jennifer Pandos. This conversation today will make a lot more sense if you listen to the first part of this conversation in our last episode of Mind Over Murder. So we're shifting into the back half of the 4 episodes in Burden of Proof, which are extremely well done, but we also want to encourage you to jump into this conversation if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, we love it when you all engage with us on social media, and we do our best to respond to everybody. So if you have thoughts, observations, raves, questions, anything else with relation to Burden of Proof, please do put all of that on our social media page. We're happy to engage with you, and we will address listener questions as needed or warranted.
We're trying not to give everything away because we're trying to respect the fact that Cynthia Hill and the team that put this together as a 4-part series, they would like you to watch all 4 episodes. Part of the thing that's key, I think, to Burden of Proof is that this is a series that was shot over a 7-year period from 2016 to 2023. A good portion of what you're seeing, and this is probably from hundreds of hours of footage, is Stephen Pandos, the brother of Jennifer Pandos, and his personal journey moving from a situation where in 2016 and for several years forward, he strongly suspects that his father, Ron Pandos, and his mother, Margie, may be involved, the father specifically, and then the mother perhaps involved in a potential cover-up. And then, of course, as Stephen learns more about his sister's disappearance and the circumstances around that time frame from investigators, forensics experts, the Commonwealth attorney, and others, he realizes his original view of the case is probably wrong. And he even says the things he was led to believe for the first 22 years of his understanding of his sister's disappearance are completely wrong. Then the conclusions that he at least is tentatively committed to in the first 2 episodes begin to shift in episodes 3 and 4.
And it was interesting to me, too, when they shifted to talking to the investigators on the case. I don't think we're spoiling too much here if we do mention that there was a lost case file. Do you think that's okay? Can we mention the lost case file, Bill?
I certainly have no problem with it. And of course, the idea that there were misfiled papers, we haven't had that happen in the Colonial Parkway Murders, but we've had discarded evidence and missed opportunities. We've had leaks of crime scene photos. So I groaned out loud when we first learned about this. As you move forward, this missing case file becomes increasingly important because there's so little for law enforcement to work with in this case.
When one of the current investigators reaches out to Stephen and says, hey, we found the original case file. It was at the bottom of a box in one of the filing rooms. They reveal once we had the original case file, we realized that we needed to shift our investigation into an entirely different direction. And that was a moment where I was like, oh my goodness. So, do tell, where are we looking now? And that is what you learn in episodes 3 and 4. This is where the investigation has shifted, and it has shifted away from the parents. Bill, even after you learned, along with the rest of us, that, hey, they're shifting the focus away from the parents, Did you still feel suspicious of the parents at all, or did you understand why they shifted?
I think that Ron and Margie's very odd responses to Jennifer's disappearance, I think actually unintentionally created suspicion. Just some of the things they did were so profoundly odd. And even in episodes 3 and 4, when the investigation shifts from the parents to other potential and strongly suspicious suspects, I wasn't dismissing the fact that Ron Pandos could have been involved in the disappearance of his daughter, but they were definitely moving down the list. Of course, I had some of the lessons learned from the Colonial Parkway murders in my head, like one of our FBI investigators saying to me years ago, no one's ever cleared in an unsolved homicide until the homicide itself is cleared. Until you actually know what happened, you can't say, oh, no longer a suspect in the Jennifer Pandos disappearance, for example. That was always in the back of my mind, but it's shocking to find out that there are some other people who really belong at the top of the list. And this is not like the Colonial Parkway murders where we have 150 persons of interest. This is a much smaller group of people. The players begin to shift around and you begin to realize we should be looking at people that probably had a role here in her disappearance, and the parents are moving down the list of likely suspects into perhaps not beyond suspicion, but definitely not the most likely.
One of my other crime-minded friends who watched this documentary after my recommendation, and he said, do you want to know when I figured out that mom and dad probably had nothing to do with it? I said, no, when did you figure that out? And he said, it came a little later in the documentary than it should have. He said, but the minute that mom allowed herself to be hypnotized, I knew that they had nothing to do with it, because you can't hide anything under hypnosis. He said if she was going to allow herself to fall under that sort of procedure, he said, I knew she didn't have anything to do with it. And I thought, well, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And he's such a smart dude that I was like, hey, I wouldn't have thought of it that way, but now that he mentioned it, I can see it.
If someone had something to hide, you'd think that they would not be willing to cede that level of control.
Yeah.
Never been hypnotized. It's a very interesting field.
Yeah.
But as I understand it from what I've read and heard, people under hypnosis will say things, admit things that they wouldn't necessarily admit while fully conscious. I know one of the efforts in the true crime space is trying to get people to remember more detail. But that could be incriminating if you're trying to hide the fact that, let's say, you're involved in Jennifer's disappearance. I think the last thing someone would do would be to say, oh, sure, go ahead, hypnotize me.
Yeah.
But someone that had nothing to hide, they'd probably say, okay, sure, if it helps.
And I really felt, for all that, I think we can all agree Ron and Margie's responses were definitely a little odd, ranging up the scale to bizarre. But I felt really awful every time that I watched Margie have confrontations both with Stephen and with the investigators, because she so very clearly is frustrated and hurt and angry and indignant that her son would believe that she had anything to do with it, when she has staunchly continued to say, I had nothing to do with this, I would never. And by the time we get to the end of the series and we learn who they're focusing on as opposed to the parents, I did feel like part of me felt bad for doubting her. I know that you're going on the journey the filmmakers are taking you on. And so for the first 2 episodes, they clearly wanted you to look at mom and dad with some suspicion. But I felt bad by the time we reached the end of it that I had thought that of Margie, because she is just so clearly, I felt awful for her. She has suffered not just, of course, the loss of one child, but it very clearly upset her relationship with Stephen. And she's had to deal with essentially like losing both her kids. I really felt awful about that. And I know I keep saying that. This tugged at my heartstrings in a way that I did not expect. Like, I didn't expect to be emotionally invested in this. I am.
I share your perspective, but let me offer 2 quick thoughts. One is that I think one of the reasons why we're so sympathetic to Margie Pandos, the mother, is that she's clearly damaged. her ex-husband, Ron Pandos, who has spent time in jail and been involved in some pretty sketchy activities over the years. He's also been married 2 times after their divorce, so he's on his 3rd wife. He's not a very nice man. He's cruel, and he's crude, and he's hard-edged. I feel like his wife, his ex-wife, is damaged goods because Stephen made it very clear that his father was very abusive to him. Physically abusive, mentally abusive, emotionally abusive, and that he felt very strongly. He didn't say that his father beat his mother or anything like that, but he did say that he was extremely emotionally abusive towards his mother. On a lot of levels, Margie's so damaged by her life experience. An abusive ex-husband, I don't think there's much way around that. Losing a daughter at age 15, and then this horrible strain between Stephen and his mother. And of course, yes, I agree that Cynthia Hill and the filmmaking team are positioning things in a certain way in episodes 1 and 2. But remember, Stephen Pandos, as the brother, it's his journey. He really believes that his father is involved in his sister's disappearance in 1987, and that he believes that essentially his father's gotten away with murder and that his mother may have facilitated her daughter's disappearance. And that is something that is unacceptable to Stephen. Emotionally, there are often times where I thought he seems very shut down, but his sense of righteousness and fairness and what's right and what should be made right in his world just burns throughout the 4 episodes. This guy really feels that his sister has been done wrong and that he wants to do everything he can to make it right, even if that means accusing his father, whom he's very estranged from, of murder, and his mother of facilitating a cover-up. Because he really believes it. I mean, he clearly explored suing his parents in a civil suit, taking legal action against them. He actually had his sister declared legally dead. That's actually quite a bone of contention between himself and his parents. They're asking him basically, where do you get off having your sister declared legally dead when her parents are still alive? But he said, I'm her brother, and I believe that she is no longer with us, and so I have had her declared dead. This clearly bothers his parents tremendously, and his father, like I said, is not a nice guy. I really disliked this guy intensely. Yeah. And then there's some very strange interview footage where his 3rd wife, who clearly wasn't around back in 1987, is acting as his spokesperson almost.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Arguing points with Stephen. And part of me just wanted to say, lady, butt out. This isn't your kid. You weren't married to my father back then. It's unbelievable.
There is so much now. I realize, of course, we're just going to do true confessions with Bill Thomas for a couple of minutes here.
Do we have to?
Why don't I ask the question and then you decide if you want to answer it? The dynamics at play between your parents and you are vastly different among those between Stephen and his parents. But I'm curious, when you were watching this, did you have moments? We know that there are moments in which you saw similarities between Jennifer's investigation and Kathy's. Did you ever feel like there were moments of kinship between you and Stephen where you could see what was going on with him and go, yeah, I got you. I get it.
Yes, very much. And you and I have talked about this before. I had a chance to meet John Walsh from America's Most Wanted a number of years ago, and he was a super nice man. I remember him saying to me, boy, the more I learn about Kathy's case, the Colonial Parkway murders, the more it reminds me of Adam's case, his son's case. And there were a lot of problems in Adam's case with missed opportunities and friction with the FBI and a lot of stuff we've talked about here. And at the same time, I remember Mr. Walsh used to use this expression about, you've been asked to join this club that no one wants to be asked to join. That is the families of murder victims. I have found over the years, since we've been doing the podcast, and of course, since I've been much more heavily involved in the Colonial Parkway murders, when I meet the loved one of a murder victim, I feel an almost immediate affinity for them. And especially these days, when I meet the siblings of murder victims, it's very easy to develop that kind of shorthand that you would have with someone because you share something that's so incredibly unusual, and there's a bond there. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to be best friends with everyone who's ever lost a brother or a sister to this kind of terrible crime, but it's very easy, and particularly now watching Stephen's story unfold, and this is really his story.
Yeah.
It's all about Jennifer and his search for answers. So much of it felt so familiar. And as I said, even Pamela, my partner, was saying, wow, where have we heard that before? Or that sounds familiar. Or she said out loud, that's exactly what happened to you. So much of his journey feels so similar. Yeah, it's a pretty easy place to put yourself.
It's just got to be so tough to take what you yourself have been experiencing for quite a while now, 37 years, and see it reflected right on TV and see another person going along with it, experiencing the same thing. Did you gain any insights about yourself and your own journey watching Stephen go through his? True confessions, remember.
I guess I'd have to think about that one. I don't know if I honestly have a great answer for that at this moment. I'll have to think about that. It's a good question. I don't have an answer at this moment.
Well, we'll come back to it again.
One of the things that's very clear as we move into episodes 3 and 4 is that this mysterious father figure, who may be the man that Jennifer Pandos babysat for,
Carrie Hendricks,
and her boyfriend, on again, off again boyfriend, Tony Tobler, definitely deserve a significant look. And that all of this talk about Jennifer's parents may actually have created a focus that's aimed in the wrong direction, that Carrie Hendricks or Tony Tobler could easily be involved in Jennifer's disappearance. And there's a third figure, a man named May, who shows up in episodes 3 and 4. And Mr. May appears to have additional information which might steer the investigation towards Carrie Hendricks or Tony Tobler and perhaps others.
The one thing that I noticed, and I'm not saying that this wasn't taken into account by James City County, it's entirely possible that it was, and they just didn't share it with the filmmakers. But when you see something in a note that references a father figure, you either look at the parents, which they did, you look at the boyfriend, you look at other figures in their life, but they seem to have missed one particular arena that they could have looked in where you would definitely find a father figure for a 15-year-old girl, and that is school. I'm wondering if they ever looked in the direction of any of the teachers at Lafayette High School. And I'm not saying, because I went to Lafayette and I had most of the same teachers she did, I'm not saying there's any teacher at Lafayette who is capable of that kind of violence. I really don't think that there is. But I am curious if at any point during the investigation, they looked at, and it could be like a coach. I don't know. They didn't talk about whether or not she did sports, but they didn't talk about coaches or anything else like that. I'm just curious if they went immediately to parents, boyfriend, father figure, but skipped school. As a teacher, when I think of father figures and I think of teenagers, I immediately go to school. So I'm curious if they ever went down that investigative route.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. In the latter part of the investigation, as the years unfold, the case is taken over by a James City County police detective named Jake Rice, whose specialty is forensics, Although Jake Rice has now retired from the James City County Police Department, he's still involved in the case. And he has a very high level of trust with Stephen Pandos. They appear to have a good relationship on and off camera. And all of these people are willing to appear on camera, which I was actually very impressed by.
Yeah, me too.
We certainly didn't see that in the Colonial Parkway murders. None of the FBI or Virginia State Police investigators would appear on camera. I found it interesting, and to the credit of the James City County Police Department and others, that they were willing to appear on camera. The first investigator, Wendi Reed, appears on camera and spoke at some length. And then Jake Rice also spoke at some length on camera. Their backfill on what happened in the investigation, including the moments that were less than stellar. The misfiling of the case file for what appeared to be a period of years, and then its rediscovery and being brought forward, which helped inform people like Jake Rice on how to move the investigation forward again. Remember, they weren't there back in 1987.
Yeah.
Some of these people, including Jake Rice, had actually gone to school with some of the people involved in this case, including Jennifer Pandos herself, so that they were high school kids back then. And of course, now they're adults in mid-career. Their candor allowed us inside that investigation to a certain extent, and I found that very helpful.
I also immediately noticed, hey, wow, they have law enforcement people willing to talk on camera, because we never, ever had that. If I'm remembering correctly, we had a former Virginia State Police investigator on to talk about the case, but certainly we did not have anybody currently working on Colonial Parkway, and I don't think we had any of the former case agents from the FBI.
No, unfortunately.
I was also very interested in the fact that they included some, I don't know that interrogation's the right word, I guess interview footage from the times that Investigator Reed was speaking to Mrs. Pandos. I was surprised, but also pleased that they had footage of that they were willing to share.
Yeah.
They shared some of the footage from Margie's hypnosis session. There was a lot more like archival, here we're putting you in the investigation room footage involved in the documentary. I was very glad to see it, because we certainly didn't have it with ours.
I was very struck by the fact that the decision by James City County Police to release that footage probably much more clearly indicated that they did not suspect the mother of involvement. The interrogation footage, and some of that got very heated, and they really went after her, trying to push her off her story. They offered her immunity in exchange for information, and of course, she turned them down because she says she doesn't know anything about Jennifer's disappearance. And the hypnosis footage, which we discussed earlier, is very striking. What, of course, isn't made available to the filmmakers are the interrogations or interviews that may have taken place of people that I think are now regarded as much more likely suspects.
Yeah.
The focus shifts in the third and fourth episodes to people that probably deserve a much closer look in terms of, do these people know anything about the disappearance of Jennifer Pandos? My guess is there's very interesting footage of those interrogations and discussions, unless they've lawyered up and refused to move forward with any kind of discussion with law enforcement.
I am interested in the fact that there was no interview footage of Ron Pandos, of law enforcement talking to Ron Pandos. Certainly, the filmmakers were able to get him in his own house discussing and things like that, sometimes with the third wife, sometimes without. But for all that we watched Margie go up against investigators a number of different times, we never saw that with Ron. And I would be very interested to know what he was like, how he would have responded when put under pressure from investigators. I really would have liked to see that. That's a fly on the wall moment for me, and we never did get to see it.
And certainly in the early going of Burden of Proof, Ron Pandos appears to be, at least from the perspective of his son Stephen, suspect number one. My guess is that there is footage of Ron Pandos, who's a difficult, kind of prickly personality. He's not a nice man, as I've said. He doesn't come across as a particularly caring individual. He's got a lot of rough edges and a lot of attitude. At the same time, he's been accused of murder, not necessarily formally as far as we know, but his son certainly believed for years, if not decades, that he was responsible for the disappearance of his daughter, which more than likely makes him a murderer.
And he kept, as we had mentioned in our previous episode, he kept making these really odd statements. Hypothetically, I hit her, she hit her head, and it killed her. And he at one point even said, "Oh, let's get a plane. I'll take you to the body." Who says that?
Exactly.
Who says that if you had nothing to do with your daughter's death? Why do you say that?
I was so floored by both of those statements, the hypothetical, and maybe he's just being a jerk, but then let's get in an airplane and I'll take you. And then, of course, he backs up and recants and says, no, he can't do that. And I'm not sure how he got himself to that place. If he's really not involved, how in the world would you say something like that? I know sometimes that in other investigations with serial killers and others, we've seen people who will string law enforcement investigators along. Part of what they're looking for is just a way to get out of that jail cell, even if it's just for a day or two, to be put on a plane and taken to another location and march around in the woods and fail to identify the right location where someone's remains might be found. You can make a case that prisoner who's probably bored out of their mind is probably looking at this as a short-term vacation. You get outside, see some beautiful scenery, and get marched around in the woods or something with a bunch of law enforcement people, which I guess from their perspective beats sitting in a jail cell.
Now that I'm thinking about it, this is literally just coming to me as we're sitting here talking. We know that Margie Pandos was offered an immunity deal, and it was immunity for everything up to homicide. Correct. They were like, we'll forgive anything up until the point that you say you killed your kid and then it's off the table. Was Ron Pandos ever offered an immunity deal?
I never got that impression.
I didn't think so, but I'm really curious as to why would you offer it to one parent and not the other if you think that they're in cahoots?
I believe that a lot of situations in law enforcement, you're looking for the partner, the facilitator, the second tier person.
The one who's going to flip.
To flip, exactly, on the principal who's responsible for that particular crime. And since law enforcement often doesn't have another way of breaking a case and identifying a responsible person, they will say to the partner, the second...
The weak link,
tell us what happened and we'll give you immunity or we'll give you some sort of deal. I don't think they would have ever done that with Ron Pandos because I believe that not just Stephen Pandos, his son, but law enforcement suspected that the father was involved in this disappearance and likely homicide.
Very interesting dynamics at play here. As the series moves toward its inevitable conclusion, and we're not going to spoil this for anybody, although anybody who's been following the press on this probably knows who the suspect is going to end up being, but I'm very interested in how this is going to resolve itself. They had mentioned at the very end that there is still lab work being done. There is still some DNA testing that they're trying to do. I am very curious to see if this case can be resolved. Jake Rice, the investigator, had said he thinks it's a solvable case. It does sound like a solvable case. I think they're really going to need to do some of the best DNA testing that they possibly can to see if they can get something off of the note after all this time.
All that being said, this is a case with significant challenges, though. There's a limited amount of forensic evidence, and it isn't like they have dozens and dozens of choices in terms of moving this case forward. They've done handwriting analysis. They've done language analysis. They've done DNA testing. I certainly sympathized with Stephen Pandos making phone calls to Jake Rice, asking for updates, asking if the test results had come back from the lab. They were doing testing at what sounded like the FBI lab as well as at private labs. And the weeks go by and he keeps looking for answers. Boy, that sounded so familiar. There's a limited amount of evidence remaining. They're going to have to get really lucky, and they're going to have to create some of their own luck in order to move this case forward. No one's ever been formally charged in this case, even though it's very evident that they have strong suspects. They have a much clearer idea of what happened the night that Jennifer disappeared. There's no slam dunks here. They are going to have to work very hard, and they're going to have to be lucky in order to move this case forward.
Now, I would appeal to our local audience listening here in the area, and that goes especially for anybody in the Williamsburg, James City County area. If you know anything with relation to the Jennifer Pandos case or any of the people involved in this case, please do not hesitate to reach out to the James City County Police and offer what you know as part of this investigation. I think we would love to see Stephen finally have the answers that he is looking for in this case.
One of the key areas that's mentioned in the documentary is that there is a suspicion that construction materials could have been stolen from construction sites. So if you know anything about that, this would have been in the 1987 timeframe. This would have involved theft of large barrels and the theft of acid. And I don't think I want to get any more graphic than that. But if you know anyone, if you were a foreperson on a construction site in the Williamsburg area in 1987 that suffered losses involving acid used for cleaning brick, obviously it can have nefarious uses as well. And the theft of probably 55-gallon drums, which obviously would have been used to place the acid in those drums. That would be something that the James City County Police Department would be very interested in hearing about. At the same time, these suspects that are mentioned in the latter part of the documentary, Kerry Hendricks, who was the man who had used Jennifer as a babysitter. Her former boyfriend, Tony Tobler, is also mentioned as a strong suspect, and Charlie May, who's actually quite distinctive. He only has one arm. He shows up very prominently in the latter episodes and provides additional detail about what he suspects may have happened. If more about any of these individuals from that 1987 timeframe, there's a possibility this could be helpful to the James City County Police Department. We'll include in the show notes how to contact the investigators. We believe anyone around the world will enjoy watching Burden of Proof, but we know we have a lot of listeners in the Williamsburg and Virginia area. If you know anything about the disappearance of Jennifer Pandos, now's the time to come forward.
Absolutely.
We hope you'll join us again next week as we continue our exploration of the Burden of Proof HBO documentary and the disappearance of Jennifer Pandos. In our next episode, we'll be featuring an in-depth conversation with retired investigator Wendi Reed, who was the lead in the Jennifer Pandos disappearance for several years. The following episode will have an exclusive conversation with Stephen Pandos, brother of Jennifer, and filmmaker Cynthia Hill, who directed and produced HBO's Burden of Proof. Please let us know what you think on our social media feeds. You can find Mind Over Murder on Facebook, as well as our ongoing conversation regarding the Colonial Parkway murders.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.